And essentially what the politicians want to do, both RFK and Trump, with slightly different variations, is to use excess Fed reserves for the Federal Reserve System over the next 5 years and buy Bitcoin. And in addition, revalue gold certificates currently held by the Fed at $42.22 to current market price, have the Fed ostensibly print the money and then pump it into Bitcoin. And then as Bitcoin price rises, they'll liquidate that over a 20-year period to pay down the national debt.
You're listening to Kerry Lutz's Financial Survival Network, where you get valuable information you just can't find anywhere else. To thrive in today's trying times, you need the Financial Survival Network, now more than ever. Go to financialsurvivalnetwork.com and get your free newsletter and gift. Financial Survival Network, now more than ever.
And welcome. You are listening to and watching the Financial Survival Network. My name's Kerry Lutz. I'm your host. And we've got Robert Kientz with us today. And Robert, you were just at the Bitcoin conference in Nashville, and you had a surprise visit from none other than former President Trump. And he had some interesting things to say about our kleptocurrencies, huh?
Yeah, there's a lot there. I want to get into Trump's speech and the Senate bill that's going to be proposed, assuming he gets elected in November, with regards to using Bitcoin and paying off the federal debt. I'll get to that in just a second. I wanted to do general thoughts on that conference real quick for just a minute. This is the second time I've gone to the Bitcoin conference. The first time I just navigated around and actually go into the conference. It was a series of networking opportunities, which I think are super valuable when you're a guy like me hunting for information, trying to understand the market, so on and so forth. Those to me are the more valuable ones. This time I actually had an industry pass and went in. We were there the day before the conference for all the industry guys. And then when the public showed up, and what you notice, there are a lot more what we call quote unquote suits at the conference than there were in years past. I had a buddy with me that had been to almost every Bitcoin conference. And typically this is a very freedom, libertarian oriented type of deal. But now you saw BlackRock and KPMG and all these big companies getting involved. So also there's a lot of lending based upon the current value of Bitcoin, and a lot of changes to mining. Mining's making a big comeback because, as I realized, mining Bitcoin is essentially the way to control its valuation. So now people are pumping money into the mining sector. One of the key developers for Bitcoin over the years had the speech before Trump, and he was talking about the current threats to the Bitcoin environment. And he said that the biggest threat are mining pools, that they're being consolidated because it's such a cutthroat industry. And that the people that own the mining pools now have power over creation of Bitcoin. Therefore, there's a lot of centralized, what would you call basically printing power in the Bitcoin space, much like the Fed owns printing of the dollars. So the existential threat to Bitcoin right now is control of the mining pools, which the developer admitted, being one of the senior developers for Bitcoin, admitted that was an existential threat to whether Bitcoin would even survive. So that was a key takeaway from that conference. Other issues, layer 2 solutions, if you don't know what that is, Bitcoin itself is small block. It cannot process a lot of transactions. They're building a layer 2 across, and that can be changed. It was a development decision, but they're processing layer 2 across the top, which is really a banking network, in my opinion, because it requires liquidity pools. It's a hub and spoke model. What's a hub and spoke model? It'd be the banking system. People that have money are going to buy Bitcoin and be liquidity providers. And so Bitcoin is going to turn into some sort of regional banking sort of based currency, and not necessarily the 10 million owner decentralized network it was originally envisioned as. So I'm seeing influences in Bitcoin that are pulling in different directions in the original vision. And it was interesting at the conference talking to people and their feelings on that, about how Bitcoin is evolving and whether it's going to survive its original design to be the true decentralized people's money, or whether it's going to be taken over by financial interests and regulated by the government.
Right.
And those are some of the existential threats talked about at the conference. Now, on to the Trump. Trump made an appearance. RFK did too, 2 presidential candidates. We had 10 different senators. Vivek Ramaswamy was there as well in the meeting right after Trump. But the big news was Trump and RFK. Trump and RFK both had similar plans for Bitcoin, and Trump was, I guess, the more widely attended one. There were at least 12,000 people standing remotely watching his. And essentially what the politicians want to do, both RFK and Trump, with slightly different variations, is to use excess Fed reserves for the Federal Reserve System over the next 5 years and buy Bitcoin. And in addition, revalue gold certificates currently held by the Fed at $42.22 to current market price, have the Fed ostensibly print the money and then pump it into Bitcoin. And then as Bitcoin price rises, they'll liquidate that over a 20-year period to pay down the national debt. Now, a couple of issues I have with this. Logistically, the bill calls for them to buy up to 1 million Bitcoin over 5 years. And as you're pumping money into it in terms of revalued gold certificate cash and excess Federal Reserves, you're going to pump that value up. And they say that they're going to sell it off to pay for the debt over 20 years. But what if they don't? Politicians are famous for saying, we've got a solution to the monetary problem. And then they get that income and they spend it on something else. So that's the first issue. What are going to be the rock solid provisions that the money is actually going to be used to pay down the debt? That's the first concern. The second concern is if I'm a Bitcoin holder and the U.S. government is going to do the biggest pump into that. Think of you're like a stock, for example, and you're Apple, and the U.S. government says we're going to put $1 trillion into Apple over the next 5 years. Then we're going to sell Apple stock, pay off the federal debt. Well, Apple stockholders probably aren't going to be too happy. I mean, on the way up, they would, but if they're holding it too long and this starts selling off in mass quantities, it's going to collapse the value of that Apple stock. Why? Because all you did was pump a bunch of money into it, right? So if I'm a Bitcoin holder, I'm looking at this going, is this a good or a bad thing? That the politicians now have grabbed a hold of it and said, we're going to use it to our advantage. Well, you have the advantage of them pumping money into it, but does that legitimize it or does that set it up for a crash 10, 15 years down the road? And if it's a crash, how many people get wiped out and could Bitcoin survive that? Mm-hmm. So is this a way that the government takes out their competition? Or is this a way, is the government really looking at Bitcoin saying this is a solution and Bitcoin's going to be a long-term strategic asset? The fact that they have an end date on this of 20 years, that they're going to buy over 5 and liquidate over 20, to me, is a pump and dump scheme the way I perceive it. And the other threat is that they're going to revalue the gold certificates the Fed has. Well, that leads to questions over how many gold certificates does the Fed have? What domain do they have over U.S. gold? And are we pilfering our gold value to pay off the national debt in the scheme? Do we even own the gold? There's so many questions I have about the scheme. It seems to me that if I'm looking at this as a super cynic of the U.S. government, that I look at it as a way that the U.S. government is propping up the dollar through revaluation of gold and pumping Bitcoin. And it's perpetuating the existing system. Now, does this extend the life of the dollar beyond what people think it currently is because of all the issues, all the money printing and all the treasury debt? I don't know. But it certainly seems like if you're super cynical, you could look at this as a politician's way of keeping the existing system. And, maybe there are moneyed interests in there whispering in their ear saying, hey, this is a great idea. Maybe this takes out the Fed's competition. I don't know. But the other hand, does the Fed really want to give up their gold certificate revaluation for this scheme? Do they want to give up their excess reserves? The Fed is independent from the U.S. government. It's owned by large global banks. The stock is owned by large global banks. So it's not owned by the federal government. It's an independent, quasi-independent agency. Yes, they appoint some of the Fed chairman, but a lot of the Fed people are part of government appointment. They're appointed by the Fed itself. So there's this weird relationship between the central bank and the government, and I'm not sure the central bank's going to sign off on this. So I expect there to be a lot of friction over this. It'd be like sandpaper trying to get this passed, and I expect a big battle. But really, I guess the biggest point to take away from this, it looks like the U.S. government is getting a little desperate with regards to the current system and valuation of the U.S. dollar and how long that has to live. And I think that they're grasping, at different things to try to perpetuate that system. At least that's my takeaway from it.
Okay. So, in effect, they want, we're all holding the bag anyway. So they rather we be holding a digital bag than a literal bag, right?
Yeah, they're looking for a way to say, yeah, we overprinted, but we're not actually going to cut spending or cut any of our programs. We're going to use these other tools to pay it off over the next 20 years to try to extend that dollar over the next 20 years. Well, what does that do? It extends the politicians' power because the politicians wouldn't have the power of the pen that they have without the dollar backing it up. Because if you can't create all this money to fund all these war and welfare programs, you can't make promises to your constituents. You lose your power as a representative. And so I think there's an element of that in there. I think there's an element of they actually want to do something, but there's also an element of how do we keep the system going? And that's the part I think that should, American consumers and the electorate should take a look at with a little bit of a side eye and say, what are your true motivations? And this needs to be talked about before you do it, because if you're talking about revaluing the gold, that needs to be a social conversation amongst the voters, because this is our war chest. And if you're going to revalue that war chest, pump it into Bitcoin and pay off the debt, that needs to be something the American people are aware of and that they're talking about.
Mm-hmm. All right. So, but it's as a practical matter here, Rob, government spending is going to have to be cut dramatically, right?
The only way that the U.S. government and the dollar will survive in tandem, they have to cut spending and they have to start paying some of it off, and they going to have to accept higher rates on their bonds in order to pay it off and to liquidate it. And believe this, the rest of the world does not want to see the dollar crash right now. There are too many foreign dollar and treasury holders, that they can't get rid of this stuff fast enough, but they want a slow decline. And so I think this is also a way for the U.S. government to assure some of their foreign dollar and debt holders that we can keep this system going by this little trick for 20 years. Don't come in and collapse the dollar by just dumping treasuries or dumping the dollar. I think the U.S. government sees the de-dollarization that's going on around the world. They see the alternative currencies. They see the alternative markets in the Belt and Road. And I think that they're trying to tell their foreign trading partners, hey, we're going to have a plan to extend this at least 20 years, and then we're going to get out of it somehow. So I think this is very much a political ploy as much as it is a potential financial solution.
Okay. Yeah, well, I agree with that. I mean, what else are they going to do, But let's face it, the reality is coming. They're not going to be able to keep spending and doing multi-trillion-dollar budgets, deficits. So what are they going to cut? Really, what are they going to cut?
Well, they have to cut promises, and that's always the last thing that a politician wants to do, because promises are what get you elected. To be honest with you, money is the mother's milk of politics in the United States. And with the Citizens' decision in 2010, corporations are treated as people, and they can contribute an unlimited amount of money to the system. So the system is really beholden to who has the last money. And so a lot of decisions made in politics are over who has the most monetary influence. So I don't, until that changes, I don't see the politicians winding down this system. There are too many influences from a corporate perspective, especially international corporates, that can now influence our legislation based on simply pumping money into the system. And until that changes, until that's reversed, and until there are guidelines put on what the U.S. government could spend, maybe it takes a constitutional amendment. It takes people getting really pissed off, basically, and protesting nationwide, things like that. I don't see the current system changing. The incentive is to keep it going as long as possible until it crashes. There's no incentive to fix it, I don't think, the way the current system is wired. And that's what a lot of people don't understand. What's good about the government, especially at the state and local level, is if you go talk to your government officials, they'll listen to you. The people still have a tremendous amount of voting power. They just don't realize they have it. If they just go out and talk to the representatives, you can influence what goes on. But it's really going to be the American people have to speak up, and they have to get to be a part of this conversation, because if they're and it's not going to happen at the national level. The national level, to me, is lost. The money is there. That's a very difficult situation to change if you're a citizen. But I think you can change it at state and local level, and I think that's where people are going to have to focus on it. But in terms of what the government can do, they're down basically to desperation moves. If they were to cut a bunch of spending, all these special interests would just pull money from the campaigns and would just put it to other people that they could elect that would, So it's very difficult. It's a very fluid situation. It's very difficult for the government now to get control of the finances at this point. I really think the finances are more run by the Fed, the central bank, and then the globals than they are anybody in Washington, D.C., because they just influence it with their money.
Yes. All right. Hey, so we were talking earlier, China is in terminal stages of decline. Yeah. Basically, it's collapsing before our very eyes. Wasn't bad enough. Their real estate market collapsed. They're having these massive floods. I don't know if you watched them or not, Rob, but they're biblical. I mean, streets that were like, main streets in cities are now mile-wide rivers. And like hundreds of cars are like washed away, like they're corks floating in a bowl of water. It's the most amazing thing. And then, the system, Communist Party is collapsing. There's a massive loss of faith in the system, and people are just giving up. So what's your take? Where does it all end?
China is in a bit of chaos. You had speculation whether Xi is healthy enough to lead that party. The direction there would be that Xi would be almost like a pseudo emperor. He would just kind of exist as long as they needed him to. Had the faith of the political elites, but whether he's healthy, there seems to be maybe a political regime change coming, which, there is some unanimity in terms of the CCP's approach to government, but still having a big change like that would be big. Then from a fiscal perspective, you had Evergrande and Cinch and all these real estate companies start to blow up.
Countrywide, sure.
Yeah. One of the things that people didn't know was something I graphed out in like 2012, 13, when I was writing, is the Chinese government's printed more currency than the U.S. government has relative to where they were in the last 10 to 12 years.
We're pikers compared to them. Right?
They printed a bunch of money, pumped up their markets, and now you're getting that market collapse. Because the difference in China and the U.S. is China's not the world reserve currency. So when they pumped up their money, it came back home to roost quicker. So they have major inflationary issues. Their stock markets are having issues. There's a little bit of a crisis right now on the political front. They're having the environmental issues, and they've got a lot on their plates to deal with.
Yeah. So, and yet the U.S. stock market keeps going up. Go figure, although, will tend to fluctuate. Well, I see here, helping our debt crisis, but bad for the rest of the world, is because there's so much turmoil happening elsewhere on the planet, especially in China. All the funds, because you can't put everything into gold. You can't put everything into Bitcoin, especially if you're an institution in China. So they've come up with a number of ingenious money laundering schemes to get money out of China into the U.S. Because nobody's putting money in Deutsche Bank in Germany over the weekend. The system might be precarious in the United States, but still, if you got to put $5 billion, park it for a week, you can do it in the U.S. You're not doing it. Or you're going to buy treasuries, right? Because as worthless as treasuries are, they're worth something right now, right?
Yeah, I think the dollar being the world reserve currency we're in a melt-up stage. So you're going to see a melt-up of the stock markets. You're going to see a melt-up of the dollar valuation relative to other currencies, like looking at the DXY. Not that the dollar is buying more from an inflation perspective, from the consumer's perspective, but the value in that index of a basket of currencies is going to stay high. Why? Because it's a reserve currency. So we're, as you say, the best looking horse in the glue factory. People, it's the milkshake theory. People are going to invest in U.S. treasuries and dollars until it doesn't make sense to do it anymore. And then that money is going to flow back. The tide's going to go out on the U.S. and it's all going to flood to the emerging markets. But the emerging markets necessarily in the system have to blow up first. Why? The U.S. just exported all of its inflation. A lot of the dollars are printed went overseas into these Eurodollar accounts. And Eurodollar just means any dollar held anywhere overseas. It started in Europe. It's all over. And those dollars are now starting to flood back a little bit. As these other countries sell off their assets to deal with all that dollar inflation, that money comes back and then it blows up the U.S. system and then the tide comes back out and it goes. So you're going to see stages to this. And, there was a good book I read a long time ago written by a currency analyst called The Dollar Crisis. And he explained how this happened in Japan and the U.S. in the 80s and 90s. And now it's going to happen more on a worldwide basis. When you're printing a bunch of currency, it affects other nations and their situation affects you. And sort of it's this back and forth until the system kind of, dies out on its own. And it all has to do with the monetary flows. So I do think that it's going to temporarily prop up the U.S. system, but then eventually U.S. system is going to come under pressure because when all these other countries crash, they have their crashes. Eventually, the U.S. has to crash. They're all interconnected through the global banking and through currencies. They all hold each other's assets. There's no safe place to go. There's no Christopher Columbus going to the New World at this point. We're all in the same boat, and it's going to affect all of us. But I do think the dollar will be the last one to fall. Okay. And I think this is setting us up for the central bank digital currency era, probably starts in a few years, where all of these fiat currencies and current systems come under pressure, and then the CBDCs are going to be rolled out as the potential solution by the central banks.
Yeah, the solution for all that ails the international monetary system. We like to say it's the best looking house in Baltimore.
Yeah.
Dollar. But what's the intrinsic value of all fiat currencies? Zero, right? And eventually they all return to their intrinsic value. This will be no different than any other. And Rob, it's great to have you on. How do we find you on the web? Where do we look for you?
So we previously were Gold, Silver, Pros. We've renamed our channel to the Freedom Report because we're expanding coverage beyond precious metals. So we'll be talking about a lot of things. We'll be talking about all the currency markets, the Bitcoin. We'll be talking about macro. We'll be talking about some of the cultural things that occur. It's interesting that when you look at changes in economic systems. With that comes changes in politics and culture. So we'll be examining that. So you can just look up the Freedom Report on Twitter and YouTube. And, we're there where we've always been, or look up Gold, Silver, Pros if you want, and you can find us there as well.
Excellent. Hey, well, maybe I'll catch you at the next Bitcoin conference. I hope to be there. Couldn't this time. And if you've got a question for Rob and myself, shoot me an email, kl@kerrylutz.com. We'll get you an answer. While you're at the site, financialsurvivalnetwork.com, please sign up for your free newsletter. Rob, always a pleasure. Thanks for stopping by.
Always a pleasure. Come on, Kerry. Thanks.
Thanks for listening to Kerry Lutz's Financial Survival Network, your solution to today's trying times. For the latest, go to financialsurvivalnetwork.com. Financial Survival Network, now more than ever.